Hi, welcome. I'm D.H. Aire, your moderator for historical research, not just words. For questions, please put them in the Q&A section. For comments, please put them in chat. Our session is on historical scholarship and where to be inspired to find information that isn't just typically written down in books. I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves in a second. Again, I'm D.H. Aire. I'm the author of 19 books, and I'm going to hit on chat a bit about where you can find more about me on those books. My latest book is Nowhere to Go But Mars. It's a novella. Melissa, why don't you introduce yourself first?
All right, my name is Melissa Scott. I've been writing science fiction for rather a long time. My most recent novel is Finders, and it is available pretty much anywhere you can find it. I've been writing science fiction and fantasy since the 1980s, and I'm a historian by training and have done a fair amount of work in historic house museums and hands-on learning.
Elaine.
Hi, my name is Elaine Isaac. I also write as E.C. Ambrose, and I accidentally clicked send earlier, so there's a bit about some of my books. Mostly known for the Dark Apostle series. These are dark historical fantasy about medieval surgery, and I just had a brand new historical fantasy novella come out, which is set in Maine just after the Civil War and features a Civil War veteran who sails away with a cargo of ice and comes home with a djinn wife. Unfortunately, all of my late releases are stuck in limbo right now in terms of print. So King of Next Week, The Hearth Witch's Son is actually releasing this weekend, and that is an epic fantasy novella, less historical, more fantastical.
RF.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Kuang, writing as RF Kuang. I wrote The Poppy War, its sequel, The Dragon Republic, and the third book in the trilogy, The Burning God, is coming out this November.
Monica.
Hi everyone, I'm Monica Louzon. I write short science fiction and fantasy and historian by training. My most recent academic piece is about Mara Jade as from the Star Wars Expanded Universe as a frontier woman, and I do a comparative analysis in this book. I have my essay on her is a comparative analysis of Mara Jade and then historical women in the American West, and doing like basically an in-depth character analysis of her in the Star Wars Transmedia franchise.
Terrific. My first question is, what resources do you seek out besides written media? I'll call on someone if they, okay, Elaine, go ahead.
I'm a big material culture fan, possibly because I was a sculptor by training, because I do a lot of wearable art projects. So I'm always looking at the stuff, and the more hands-on I can get with the stuff, the happier I am. If I understand the process by which things were made, what materials they used, where they came from. So often resources for that would be museum collections. If you are able to actually visit workshops where people are making things in the manner that they used to, or ideally even to get your hands on or take a workshop from someone who has studied the technologies and techniques of the past. Nothing beats being able to touch it, to feel it, to move it, and to learn how things work and why.
Melissa.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, especially the getting your own hands on it. And a number of historic museums do offer seminars where you can go and cook in the actual kitchens over open fires. You can work with that with spinning wheels of the period. A number of the domestic arts you can actually practice. Historic New England is one good source for that. They have a number of workshops, or have had in the past, and I think that's available in a lot of different places. but just the actual, as you said, getting your hands on it and understanding how it works and how it doesn't work, where things fail and where they don't fail is really makes a huge difference.
Who else?
I'll go. So I think location is really important for me. When I wrote The Poppy War, I was lucky enough to be living in mainland China that year, which let me, so I lived in Beijing and I was a mile's walk away from the Forbidden City. So I could just go on like morning walks and look at those old temples and those palaces. And I could like take train trips to places like Zhangjiajie and other places where I could see like Shaolin, like temples, and just incredible breathtaking scenery. And there's nothing quite like being in those locations and feeling that grand scope of epicness that then allows you to convey like what your characters would have been seeing and how they would have been feeling, because like there are parts of China that really do feel like you're stepping into another world. That mountain range in Zhangjiajie, that's where they filmed Avatar, like those stone pillars stretching into the sky, like those are real, and it was really, really cool to see.
Monica, that brings me to you.
I would agree with location being super important. I try to, when I travel and go new places, I try to go to historic sites or World Heritage sites or museums. One that sprung to mind while Rebecca was talking about seeing the Forbidden City all the time. When I went to Croatia and Dubrovnik and Bosnia, we went up the mountainside just outside Dubrovnik to the old fort museum that was there, and like seeing, it was just like, it's very different to see the history in person and see like the bullet holes in the apartment block walls and seeing the descriptions I find it really fascinating, the events that are described in a museum exhibit and the tone of the narration, how objective or how not objective the narration for that museum may be. Because there's a lot of, especially for the one outside Dubrovnik, there's a lot of narrative in that, like the hateful Serbs did this, and it was very much like charged language that you wouldn't find in the Smithsonian, like, or other places. But I like to look at artifacts, and I like to look at art in particular for world building and for just trying to figure out what my characters that I'm writing about in my novels are, what they're experiencing, what they're seeing, and what they're touching and what they wear. I'm a very visual person, and it's hard for me to fully explore a story if I don't have a sense of what the culture and the background behind the culture, even if that's not going to show up in the story necessarily, just having those pieces and things to look at.
I once was in a Crusader escape tunnel. I'm 5'6". I realized Crusaders were really shorter than me. I mean, it is kind of humbling when you realize your height compared to where you're standing in an actual historical place, whether it's an archaeological dig or, a church or synagogue or mosque, gives you a sense of perspective that you might not have by never having left home. So this leads to my second question. How do you use these resources to inspire yourself? How does the inspiration come out? Am I going to call on someone?
I mean, I'm always happy to jump in, but.
Elaine, be the first to jump in.
So one of the super cool things I got to do as part of my physical research for a so far unpublished epic historical fantasy novel was to visit a model of Susong's astronomical clock, which was originally built around 1090 AD in Kaifeng, China. But the Museum of Science London did a big exhibit about it, of course, years before I discovered and became interested in it myself. But if you write to them in advance and are very polite, I am an author, and I was able to get an hour-long visiting slot where they brought the model out to me and put it on a table, and I got the opportunity to really examine it from all angles, to make my own sketches of it. And of course, I had read a lot about it. I had seen diagrams that were drawn at various eras, but to be with it really helped me to picture how my characters would move through a similar construction and how they would physically interact with it. So having that experience got me started building scenes around this, sort of monumental object that was going to be the centerpiece of the story, and really helped me to understand the relationship of my character as they would move through that space, and to look at the complexity of the elements that went into that, the scientific understanding of the instruments that they needed to create. So it sort of moved both backward and forward through the story. It helped me pin down specific scenes that I'd want, and also to give me a deeper understanding of which areas I needed to still learn more about in order to make that believable in the narrative.
It took me a while to think of an actual answer to this, because this informs, as Monica was saying, it's once you get the visions in your head, it becomes this background. But actually, one of the when I was working on the Points novels, which are they're essentially murder mysteries set in a fantasy setting where astrology works. I was lucky enough to attend a lecture on early modern stagecraft across Northern Europe, and got to see a really good model of the scenery mechanisms for a Swedish theater, which included possibly the best murder method I've ever had. Several large gears that someone could fall, unfortunately, into and be, yeah. I don't think that the professor really appreciated my questions about it, about exactly how large those were and what the forces involved were, but oh well.
Anyone else? Because I was hearing, RF, you having been to the Forbidden City, walking around, has that been used as inspiration in what you've written?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, I saw a well where supposedly a concubine had been drowned, and I thought, well, now I have to drown a concubine in a well. But yeah, I mean, I think insofar as we're talking about locations, right, like there are some places where the stories just really write themselves, and you don't really even need to go seeking out inspiration. Like, it's telling you, here's what happened, write it down. And so I've talked about being in China, but I'll talk about this new project now. I did a degree at Cambridge University last year, and I'm doing another degree at Oxford this year. And those places are so full of history and so full of magical potential. I mean, like, you read The Golden Compass, you think about Philip Pullman writing about like his version of magical Oxford. And then especially like when you walk around at night, right? Like then Oxford and Cambridge really transport themselves, like, and under the light of the street lamps where you can't see a lot of the modern technology, it feels as if you could be walking around this cobblestones and it's the 1800s and there's choir practice going on somewhere. So you hear this like ghostly ethereal singing and you think, oh, well, that's a ghost. I'm being haunted. I'm going to die now. And just like being in that environment was so conducive to coming up with the kind of story that I'm going to write next, which is a dark academia story set in Oxford. And I mean, like, I feel really lucky because not everybody can just like go to a place that is so packed with this storytelling potential. But that is the magic of location. And if you can go somewhere, I think that's one of the best ways to jumpstart a new project.
Monica?
So my short story, San Cibernetico, is about an orphan on a world ship who creates a cult saint around, basically turns this cyborg mummy that he found and turns it into a cult saint for orphans on the world ship. And I wrote that whole story while traveling in Argentina, just with a bunch of friends. I just like jotted it back and down in the back of my notebook. But it was partially inspired by seeing some of the Gaucho Gil cult saint little altars they have throughout Buenos Aires and some of the neighborhoods and like along the highways, and by cult saints, I mean the saints that are regarded and worshipped by people, like the regular people, but they're not regarded or acknowledged as actual saints by the Catholic Church or organized religion. And I ended up going down this whole rabbit hole of looking into different cult saints in Latin America and even the US as well, as part of that, based on the experience of like being like, what is this altar thing here? What's the deal with that? And then finding out about Gaucho Gil and that there's even more than that. That was really cool.
In terms of place and location and getting an idea, I haven't decided to drown a concubine by coming up on a well, but when I was a teenager, I was living in the St. Louis area, and east of St. Louis is Cahokia Mounds, which is actually the oldest Indian city, which at peak had 20,000 inhabitants around 800 years ago.
It's on my bucket list to go there.
I stood on the High Priest Mound, and a few years ago I thought, what would happen in an apocalyptic story if that mound, people forgot what it was built on, what it really was? So I said a story about 1,000 years from now, and the people didn't know what it was, just like no one knew what it was in 1920. And I wrote a really nice short story with it. So you can really come up with some great stories, even using the place you're visiting, if the genre is right. Now I want to ask, I heard someone say they'd gone to a museum. I wanted to ask if you've used paintings as inspiration or learned anything from a painting that helped you with your stories for historical research purposes.
I'll jump in on that one.
Please.
So I did in undergraduate, when I was an undergrad, I did a paper on representations of, I have this whole stack of books here. You can't see it, but these are the ones that are in the way. There's these colonial Mexican Costa paintings that they're from the late 1700s, early 1800s, and colonial Mexico was trying, the government was trying to keep people from mixing the European blood too much. So they came up with a whole system of permutations for what it means if you have a Native American who mixes with a Spaniard and then their babies and then mixes with like someone else, and they have like up to 64 and 96 different permutations. So Costa paintings, in the paper on them, there's a lot of representation. So you'll have violence is typically represented when you have a Spaniard mixing with someone who's not a Spaniard. So you'll have like, if you corrupt the blood, the European blood, then you're going to get more violent, you're going to get more wild. And you have like paintings like this, where you have I think it's a Spaniard and a mulatta, and they have these children and they're misbehaving. And then if you go further down, and you get it's super racist, like very racist. And it's very fascinating to see how the representations of race in these pictures, like they were trying to box people in with them, with these paintings. And they have like depictions of domestic violence. The white, like typically it's like a Native American male is like abusing his wife, and then the African American women are beating up their white husband, like, or their white lover, whoever, like in this picture. And I found it really interesting as part of my the paper that I was working on. I ended up, like, for the paper I was looking at primary sources to see, are these representations accurate of what society was actually like, what other primary sources are out there, or was this mostly just imposed? But from the writing perspective, I found them fascinating for seeing the class descriptions, like what is in the background, what are the people doing, what do they have access to, or what are they expected to have access to, and that informs, like when I'm world building for the stories I work on, it informs, okay, what do I need to be? It just makes me think about different things to pull in, like little details that are like, these are kind of fun to have as a detail. I don't need to go into depth on them, but it's like to make it feel more authentic. So Costa paintings, they're pretty great. I like them for, at least that was like my initial like foray into using historical paintings for writing inspiration.
Elaine.
Since I was the person who brought up museums, most of the museums I go to are not art museums. They are science and technology museums. They are local historical museums, which are a lot of fun because they're sort of the quirky understanding that local people have of the history of their small town. New England, almost every town has a historical society. And when I was researching the King of Next Week, I got to spend a happy day at the Historical Society building in Phippsburg, Maine, surrounded by the little models that people had made of local village items. They had a huge map on the wall showing all of the graveyards in town, of which there are 102, and this is not a big place. So just getting that sort of depth of history from rooting around and being able to visit the places where people have accumulated that stuff. But it's interesting that, from what Monica had said, my period most of the time is the Middle Ages, and there has been a sense until fairly recently that the European Middle Ages were somehow entirely white. And the more you look at art, the more you realize that this is not so, that there have always been a variety of people in the background, and sometimes in the foreground of those pictures. There's some fantastic old masters, Dutch masters paintings of Black individuals that have recently been in a show in the Netherlands. Always here, we just were ignoring them, eliding them, whitewashing them, and understanding that history is a lot more rich in person and in depth than it's probably been presented in a history class, is one of the valuable things that I get out of that experience.
Someone years ago told me they'd looked at a Rembrandt and they saw that the church was the highest building, and they saw the mosque and the synagogue were lower, and they realized everyone in the picture was walking into a synagogue or mosque was taking 3 steps down, and they realized the synagogues and the mosques were actually the same height. So they realized from a historical perspective, the churches had to be the tallest structure in town. And Rembrandt was painting something that he was kind of like saying there's an inequity here, but everyone is adapting to it, which is very important to think about in cultures and world building. Melissa, it looked like you had a comment.
Yeah, I was building on what Elaine was saying, that the backgrounds of paintings are often the most interesting things. You see what's going on, particularly early modern Dutch paintings are particularly good for this because the genre is interested in everyday life, but the burghers in the foreground, and then in the background you have everyone else going about their business. You have a picture, you have a sense of what ordinary households looked like. The people who could afford to have a picture painted, that class has dropped considerably. It's no longer the most wealthy. The middling burghers could have a house there, have a portrait done, and their house is preserved in paint when it's not necessarily preserved in reality. I also think paintings are very helpful for clothing details. I mean, you may hear the difference between what people complain about as, oh my God, what kids today are wearing, because that is a continual complaint throughout the ages, and what you actually see in a painting. There's continual descriptions of a medieval dress style, medieval surcoat that is cut in so that there's a wide shoulder piece and a very narrow front piece, and it shows a great deal of the undergown at the sides, and those were described by contemporary churchmen as the gates of hell. But you don't find them quite that extreme in actual pictures. So it's an interesting contrast between what people say and what you can find in the portraits, and what you think might actually be going on.
RF, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, speaking of backgrounds of paintings, one of my favorite episodes of Doctor Who is the Vincent van Gogh one, where they see all these paintings and they're like, oh, he was trying to describe this monster. And then of course, that wonderful scene where they bring Van Gogh to the Modern Museum of Art and show him his legacy. But the point being, I think that in addition to teaching us historical details, like what people were wearing or what values or messages the artists were trying to convey, I really love speculative fantasy that finds clues or symbols hidden in paintings that weren't necessarily, the intention of the artist, but it's just like such a cool spin on art that we're super familiar with.
Okay, my next question I want to take, since we're not talking about just written words, I want to touch on oral tradition. Does storytelling or folklore inspire any of your stories, things you've heard orally over the years? Melissa first.
I've been working off and on a novel based off of a short story that I did called Mr. Seeley, which is set in Depression era Arkansas. It's sort of magical realism in the South. And man, if you get people talking about bootlegging the Depression and farming, anybody that my parents know, that my parents knew, you hear the most amazing stories from the most respectable people.
I know a bootlegger.
I met William Faulkner's bootlegger one time, and he was recovering from having his throat cut at this particular. He was invited to an academic conference on Faulkner to discuss. It was to discuss Yoknapatawpha as a real place, and yeah, he had had his throat cut by the other boyfriend of his girlfriend, none of whom were under the age of 75. But, but these stories are so good, whether or not they're true, they reflect a place and they reflect a time in a way that nothing else does. They tell you what people thought were important, what people remember from that time. And they create a feeling of place that is very hard to find any other way.
Okay, Elaine, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I love what Melissa said about the stories that people tell as their recollection of it, what was key. But the reason that I put my hand up is that one of my research interests is Mongolia and the history of Mongolia, and I got the opportunity to visit there several years ago now. But the Mongolian throat singing, Khlume singing, is very much tied to the landscape. And with careful listening, you can hear different elements of how the water flows, how the grass grows, the kinds of insects, birds, and all of the creatures that populate the landscape that they live in, because as a nomadic people, the camps that they move to are so vital to them. So my first international thriller novel, The Mongol's Coffin, is about a musical map, which is encoded in this kind of landscape-oriented singing.
Okay. Anyone else have a comment on oral history folklore?
Yeah, sorry, my
yes.
Wi-Fi cut out for a second. So if somebody's already said this, then somebody just interrupt me and say we can move on. But one thing I really love about oral storytelling traditions as opposed to written text is that oral storytelling always changes in the retelling, because unless you have an incredible memory, you can't repeat the same sequence of words again, which means that we learn a lot from different values or different iterations of the same myth and the ways that they've shifted over time. Like one of my favorite myths is the story of the Moon Lady, which we tell during the Moon Festival in China. And the lady is on the moon because her husband shot down 9 of the 10 suns that were scorching the earth, and was rewarded with a peach of immortality. And Chang'e, the Moon Lady, ate the entire peach instead of sharing it with her husband. So she flies up to the moon because instead of just becoming immortal, she becomes so ethereal that she can no longer stay on Earth. And it's told as a story like she was foolish and greedy, and now she's stuck on the moon and she's alone. But there are also versions of the myth where she does this on purpose, and she wants to be on the moon and she wants to be a god and live forever. And it's just like so fascinating to see how many different versions of the same story you can find across cultures. Ted Chiang has a really good short story about precisely this, written versus oral storytelling, and I'm forgetting its title, but it is in his collection, Exhalation.
Okay. Monica, do you want to take on the question about oral?
I am blanking on oral storytelling, other than I don't have any instances with it tying into my story beyond like my work, beyond people telling me about like the stories behind cult saints and this like that sort of angle of things. Although there's a band called Calico Jack, and they were, I don't remember if it was they were founded because there was no Chesapeake, like the main singer, the lead singer lady, she was doing a whole bunch of research into Chesapeake Bay folk stories during the colonial era and industrial revolution, because she was like, there's sea shanties everywhere, the Chesapeake Bay must have some. And because she found that there really weren't nearly as many passed down as she was expecting there to be, she started, her and her group started making more songs about the Chesapeake Bay. And it's beautiful music. They have a great one about the oyster. I think it's the Oyster Ward or the Oyster Man's Wife. Both of those, I believe those are the titles. They're really good. But other than that, I don't really have a whole lot. I do more music than oral storytelling.
Yeah. Years ago, I was told a legend, which I could never document. I could never find it written anywhere. The legend was that there was a Torah scroll on the Santa Maria. So that really kind of bothered me. Like, why, if the person telling me thought it was a true story and wasn't folk tales, where did it come from, and why, you know, how could it be possible? So I researched who on the Santa Maria crew was Jewish, and I got about 8-9 people, and I got a Columbus Jewish connection, and then I wrote a time travel story with those people ending up with the Torah scroll on the Santa Maria, because if they didn't get that Torah scroll, bad things were going to happen in the story. So you can use legends and you can use things you learn about oral history. And I'm a genealogist, so I hear a lot of untruths told by family. Oh yes, none of us were ever this, or there were no people who did that, and no one ever did anything on the shady side here. No, no, no. And then you do your research and you see, oh, this one has a criminal record, and this one's this, right? But there's things you can learn about, yeah. There's things you can learn about what's true and not. And that's where I want to take the next question, which is part of the Q&A, was something about, are you finding truths and untruths when you look at what your various resources, and are they inspiring you?
Yeah, one of the things that you have to pay attention to, especially if you're looking at any kind of primary resources, secondary resources too, definitely, is who is telling me this story and why are they telling it? And even if they are presenting it as history, it is still a narrative that's being constructed from the evidence at hand, or sometimes from their conjectures about the evidence at hand. So when I was researching my Mongolia book, looking at the different attitudes that contemporary writers had about the Mongols and what they were up to is very interesting, because you can sort of compare the gaps between what the Mongolian sources tell you and what the sources coming out of the Islamic world are telling you, and what, of course, the Christians are telling you. So being aware of who is telling this story, even if it purports to be history, and why are they telling it, especially if you have the opportunity to look at different sources across a spectrum of experience and distance from the events being described or from the people being described, that can be immensely helpful. My father's been doing a research project, which he now teaches as a course called Lies, Spies, and Sunken Subs, around a submarine that went down, Russian submarine during the Cold War. And a lot of that material is now becoming declassified, or the people who were involved in the actual investigation are writing books about it. And each person's book has a slightly different take. So often the more interesting aspects, where you learn a lot, is from the gaps between the resources. And that will suggest to you the attitude of the people that you are referring to. So.
Melissa.
And sometimes the things that you know are historically unlikely actually make a more interesting story. Lisa Barnett and I did a historical fantasy called The Armor of Light, set in an alternative Elizabethan England in which magic works the way the Elizabethans thought it did, in which we assumed, and this was written back in the 80s, that Christopher Marlowe was in fact an English spy working for the Elizabethan government. At the time, the documentation available made that really improbable. What's been fun over the last 20 years is they keep coming up with more and more research has been done in the state rolls and papers, and there's more and more evidence available about Walsingham's Secret Service, and more, it looks like we got it right after all, that in fact we can connect more and more to the Secret Service, which that's been fun actually, because we assumed, well, this is fantasy and alternate history, and less of it was than we thought so.
Anyone else want to? RF?
So one of the first lessons that like any history major learns in undergrad is that museums have agendas. There is always a reason why you are being shown the objects or the testimonies or artifacts that you are being shown. There's a reason why they're put in a particular order. There's a reason why the write-up on the little plaque that goes next to the object is worded in the way that it is. Even the architecture of the museum, the order in which you see things and the order in which things are presented to you or explained to you by museum docents, like that is all political. Even if it is political for what we would call the right reasons. So and I think it was something that was important to internalize to me as like a kid coming to college and thinking that, oh, you go to the museum and then you just learn about what happened historically. But I wrote my undergrad dissertation on commemoration of the Nanjing Massacre. And you go to the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Museum in China, and it is so clear what the agenda is. And this is an episode of history that is very fraught, where the number of casualties still cannot be agreed upon. And the ways in which you are taken first to the burial sites and then the testimonies and then shown these like awful, really visceral exhibits, and then you end through a hallway that leads to like a peace statue and pictures of like Sino-Japanese like peaceful summits. That's all trying to tell you something, and so it's really helpful not just to go to the museum to see the things, write about, but also to understand the stories that are told about these objects already and to consider how you're going to engage with them.
Monica, you want to take on the question?
I was thinking I was going to, and then Rebecca said like everything so well. I'm good, pass.
Okay, so let me take it from one of the questions in the Q&A list. Basically, the issue is if you can't be there, are online resources of seeing museum materials something you would use and something that you find appropriate? Or would you have a lot of questions about not actually being there?
I find that the online museum exhibits are great for getting a sense of the objects. Like if you can't go somewhere, it's nice to have that access and the ability to look at them. But it's it's very different when you can actually see an object in person and see the scale, and you, when you see something in person, you think about the mechanisms behind it, the weight of the object, how it was worn or used, and like the logistics of holding something. Sometimes, like, yes, like I'll have those thoughts if I'm looking at something in an online exhibit, but in person, it's just like you can walk around it, you can see it from more angles, you can. It's kind of like the online exhibits are nice because you can see the object by itself, but it's also really informative to see where the museums put that object, like what other objects they put around it or with it in the same case, or if they put it on a pedestal by itself.
Melissa?
One thing that goes along with the online museum experience, I find the amateur experts online to be extraordinarily helpful. Like Rebecca said, you have to be really, really aware of agenda when you're dealing with a lot of the websites. But if you're looking certain kinds of information, if you're looking for information, for example, on early aviation, there's a ton of websites out there where you can find where airfields were in America in the 1920s and track what you could buy there. You know, whether could you get actual airplane gas, or did you have to use regular gasoline at this if you stopped there? There are people who can provide you with PDFs of the manuals for a Ford Trimotor, which is incredibly useful. That kind of information, it's not precisely hands-on, but it's primary sources that you can get your hands on. I found photographs on eBay of the visit of the German cruiser Emden to Honolulu in 1936, I believe, which was a plot point in a book. And by God, somebody had them and he was not able to sell me the photos, they'd been sold, but he was able to give me JPEGs. So that kind of source can be extraordinarily useful, and you don't have to be able to travel to make use of that.
Anyone else want to touch on the online resources?
So this is not about online museums, but Google Earth has been weirdly helpful in quarantine. And I actually used Google Earth first because I'm moving to New Haven in the fall. If it is safe to do so, and I wanted to I was about to sign a lease on an apartment that I had not seen in person, and I wanted to see what the surrounding neighborhood was like. So obviously I took myself on a little virtual stroll, but then I started doing that for the writing process too. Like I would just Google Earth myself around London to see how the streets were arranged. Like it adds so much flavor and details to a story you're writing if you're able to say, and on that corner is a convenience store, even if you've never been there before. And that's generally like a good tool to have even when we're not in quarantine, because like none of us, or very few of us, have the money to just like get on a plane and fly wherever to like Stonehenge to see what the layout is like. So definitely check it out. It is not something I had incorporated into my writing process before, but now do like every day.
Elaine?
And when you go, look at the photos. If you go to a location on Google, they'll tell you how many people have posted photos there. And especially for any kind of historical site, archaeological site, dozens, hundreds of people have posted photos, and many of them are now posting virtual tours where they will do panoramic shots. There's a lot of stuff that can give you a much better idea, if you're not able to actually go there, of what it would be like to be in that place. How high are the ceilings? How low are things? How close are the doorways? What are the shape of the windows? And all of those kind of details that you can gather from other people's, sort of crowdsourcing your research.
Now the coolest thing would be a Google Earth that has different time periods, like an 1800s London Google Earth. But the closest thing we have to that actually is the Assassin's Creed video games. Like with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and it's like a startling accurate rendering of what Athens would have looked like. It's great.
There's a 1204 map of Istanbul, Constantinople that you can find where they've done flyovers of the virtual buildings. There are actually a lot of them, many of them available through archaeological or historical research sites. So they're a little bit sort of harder to find than some things, but there's a lot of 3D renderings now of what places were like.
Melissa, you had your hand up.
I was going to mention also there's, and I think somebody may have mentioned it in the chat as well, there are a number of sites, if you're interested in 19th century material, a number of sites that collect, among other things, the bus schedules and the train timetables. You can actually find an awful lot of information. VictorianLondon.org is one of the big sites, and there's a ton of material available out there.
Monica?
Just chime in, if you are looking, sometimes there's other map websites like out that can help you off, like in addition to the Google Earth and using the Street View. Sometimes there's other websites where people just happen to use those more than they use Google Earth. Wikimapia is another really good crowdsourced one. And I'm trying to think, sometimes there's local, like specific countries will have their own local Street View maps available as well. One other historical, it may fall under the category of book, but probate records, like when people die, the death inventories that they have, those are fascinating historical sources to pull through or pull from for when you're working on like character in their life. Like think about what will they die with, what will they leave with behind when they die, or what did they possibly get from their parents, like that kind of thing. Probate records are awesome, and land records too.
We have about 5 minutes left. I want to sneak in one question that came in on the Q&A. What fun thing have you come across that you haven't been able to use yet? Monica.
So there are letters, epistolary letters that were from a Jesuit priest colonizing Maryland to his sister back in, I think it was in England. And the first letter, he's like, hey, found this cool animal, I fed it some stuff and I'm sending it over to you. And the next one is like, sorry, the squirrel died. I'm sending you this really pretty red bird, here you go. The next one is like, sorry, the cardinal died. Here are 3 mummified hummingbirds for your viewing, display, and enjoyment. And I'm like, I need to work this into a story somehow. And then there's also like jewelry and stuff I've seen in museums that I'm like, oh, this would be awesome, but I just have to figure out where that would fit in the costume for the characters.
Anyone else? Elaine?
One thing that fascinates me is the history of physical hoaxes. So things like Piltdown Man. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to view the actual original fur-bearing trout, which is sort of infamous from black and white postcards, principally around New England. And I've been seeing the postcards and reproductions of them for years. So it was delightful to see the actual fur-bearing trout in this, again, obscure historical society in Vermont. And someday that fur-bearing trout, man.
Anyone else want to take it?
When my boyfriend and I went to Rome last winter, we went to the Da Vinci Museum, and they just had this hallway full of recreations of inventions from his sketchbook that never led to anything useful. And one of them was a prototype of a modern tank, which looked like a teepee kind of, and it was wooden and it had like little slats in the sides and it moved on wheels. And I just thought it'd be so funny for this like goofy wooden contraption to be roving through a battlefield. And I really want to work that into a fight scene somehow. I think like just like the stuff in Da Vinci's notebooks, like you could write hundreds of sci-fi short stories about them.
Okay, Melissa, do you have anything?
I've used most of mine, unfortunately. I have to go do more research.
Well, what I haven't used is for 5 years, I rented a basement apartment in a 200-year-old farmhouse. And in the last 3 months I lived there, I learned that I was living in a stop of the Underground Railroad.
Cool.
That my neighbors above me who were African American, the slaves hid in their apartment. And there were drawings they left around the chimney because they were bored as they were waiting. And I knew where the next stop was. And I was like, oh, so they went either from there to here or there, to, you know, either way. I've got to use the Underground Railroad someday, or some variation of it on some other planet, because this is just I live where they've been. I've got to figure a way of doing that. So as we now wrap up, and I'm going to ask everyone to give a little detail about where we can find you, I just want to say that anyone who wants to continue some of the discussion with a few of the panelists, a couple of the panelists are going to go to the historical channel on Discord, so you can go there. I'm going to be going to my spot in the dealer's room if anyone wants to continue discussing with me any of the issues that came up today. And on that note, I'm going to call Melissa first for final remarks.
Well, thank you all for being here. This was certainly fun. You can find me on Twitter as @BlueTerraplane and on the web at melissa-scott.com. The hyphen is important. Please use it.
Okay, Elaine?
I'm going to be in the history channel on Discord in just a few moments. So if you want to continue the conversation, we will go there. One thing that we didn't talk about much is just it wasn't aliens. Ancient peoples knew a lot of stuff. They were capable of doing a lot of stuff, and they did a whole freaking lot of stuff.
Monica?
You can follow me on Twitter at molo_rights. I'll put that in the chat. And then I'm also going to go hang out in the Discord as well with Elaine.
RF?
You can find me on Twitter at @KuangRF or my website, rfkuang.com, on the Discord this weekend. But I have a coffee clash coming up at 6 EST and a reading tomorrow.
Okay. You can find me at a few more panels at Balticon beginning tomorrow. My website is dhaire.net, where you can find out more about my books and you can see my blog. Thank you all for having joined us.